Um, I was born on the Eastern Shore, and my family goes back to 1738 on the Eastern Shore of Maryland and Virginia. First living in Maryland when they came from Africa, moving to Accomack County, and then at the end of the 1700s moving to Northampton County, and we've been here ever since. I started to, in our household, we always heard about things that happened in the old days. My mother and father always talked about the old times, and my grandparents. But I guess in 1991, when my father was sick, and my mom and my dad and I were closeted in a hospital room together, we talked about more things. And I was really surprised that when I went to look for the things he talked about, that I could find them. And I'd come back to the hospital and say, I found so-and-so. And he'd say, I told you, And it was like a disease. I caught it. And now I just read a lot. I study a lot. Like the old records, like reading about old things. Africans came to this country, to this colony, and Northampton County was the 8th shire to this county. Early on in its settlement, they were probably people that came from South America. They were probably people who were slaves, surely, but not held in the same confinement of slavery as came later. Their names were Rodriguez. They were Francisco. And they came and they lived. When the first Africans came to the Eastern Shore, there was one county, not two, in Virginia. It was the 8th shire. There were very few houses, if any. They were rough. And they entered a life of servitude, and they lived that way. There were some that were able to find their way free, but for the most part, the Africans were in servitude, as were the white people who came into the shore, but the servitude was different. African Americans were servants for life, and white people who came into the shore were servants for 7 years, for 10 years, for a specified amount of time. So there was that major difference. We don't really know, I don't know, how Anthony Johnson gained his freedom. But one man that we know how he gained his freedom was Francis Payne. Francis Payne owners lived not in Northampton County. I'm thinking they lived in Maryland. But he gained his freedom by exchanging 3 slaves for his own life, for his own freedom. And they exchanged it, and he went on. He married. He was free. He married. He lived a life of a free person. But I have to say here that when you talk about a person being free, how free is free? What could they do? I mean, Anthony Johnson was the only black who owned property. Africans bought sheep and cows and lived in a house that was probably on somebody else's land. So I'm not really sure what free really meant. I think that having land at that time, whether you were African or you were white, was important. We don't know how Anthony Johnson got that land. We know that he had 50 acres of land for every person he imported into the colony. But how he was put into position, or how he reached the position of being able to import those people into the colony, we don't know. He was truly the only person, the only African who lived in Northampton County who owned land. Most of the other Africans that we know about, that we can find records of, owned only small things: their clothes, cooking utensils. They own a cow, a sheep, a calf, and that's it. We have record of several Africans owning horses, but surely, Anthony Johnson was the only one who received a patent for property. Some historians have said that Anthony Johnson had a very close relationship with Richard Bennett, and that he may have been a slave on his plantation on the western shore of Virginia. I don't know that. The only records that we can find of that is just one document where Richard Bennett contacts Nathaniel Littleton and asks that he see to it that Anthony Johnson receive a calf. That's the only contact that we can see on the shore that he had with Bennett. Later on in his life, when he moved to Punkatig, we know that he was friends with Ann Toft and with Edmund Scarberg. Anthony Johnson was probably not unlike many Africans who came to the colony at that time, and not unlike many whites that came to the colony at that time, because I think that there was nothingness. I think that there were trees and water, and they had this in common. They had in common that they had to survive in a wilderness. White people came as servants for a certain amount of time, but Anthony Johnson and other blacks came as servants for life. It wasn't different because everybody was just trying to get from day to day. They were just trying to live. They were trying to eat. They were trying to sleep. If they had children, they were trying to see to their children. In the beginning, I don't think it was a lot different. As it went on, it was a lot different, I think that Anthony Johnson may have gotten his freedom by doing a good deed for somebody. If indeed he knew Richard Bennett, maybe he did something for Richard Bennett. Maybe he saved a life. I don't know. But, I'm fairly sure that he wasn't just given his freedom because he was loved. Other people, other blacks, got their freedom in different ways: by saving money, by having a little patch of land and growing something and selling it and saving their money. With Francis Payne, by selling 3 servants to his master and his mistress, and in exchange for his own freedom. So there were ways, and I'm sure that when you're confronted with a situation, when you're in that situation, you're very creative about how you're going to get what you want. And I think that those Africans were very creative. I think that life was hard, but it was as easy as it was because they were creative and because they knew how to move around and how to do. And I think that they learned that knowing that their lives depended on it. At the time that Anthony Johnson was a landowner, and I need to say again, he was the only black landowner in the 17th century that lived in Northampton County, which later became Accomack County. At that time, it wasn't easy to get your freedom, but as the years went on, by 1660, 1670, the laws started to come about. Virginia needed a workforce. It needed people to work. So Virginia, one by one, cut off the freedoms that these black people had enjoyed. And by the end of the 17th century, there was no freedom left. Those people who had gained their freedom before the passing of the laws remained free, but they remained free at peril, because now the landowners didn't just have to worry about slaves. They had to worry about the influence that the free black people had on the enslaved black people. So the free people were then in peril. While we're thinking, while we're researching and we're finding the things that went on during the 17th century, the beginning to the middle of the 17th century, we are aware that while things were looking smooth and people were fitting into certain places and knowing their niches, as early as 1630, our records record that there was dissension, that there were people who were lashed, who were brought to church for cohabitating, blacks with whites. So we know that even on the surface, we're talking about how smoothly things had gone on, or how well this group got along with that group, or how well they fit into their little niches. You know, there was an undercurrent from the beginning. Robert Sweet, who was one who was brought in front of the church for defiling himself by lying with a black woman. This was only the beginning, and this was as early as, like I said, 1630. Anthony Johnson's house caught fire, and he lost, according to our records, everything. I'm sure that created a hardship for him, because there was nobody that was going to back him up. You know, he had this fire and he lost everything. His wife and his children went to court and asked to be tax-free because it was a burden having to pay taxes, and they'd had this fire. And the court said that Anthony and Mary Johnson had been in the colony for 30 years, and that they were upstanding citizens, and they made Mary and her daughters tax-free. The only problem with that is that white women in the colony at that time were already tax-free, and the Johnson family only reached that status by losing everything that they had. So while it was a compliment to his good character that they would let them be tax-free, it also shows us that there wasn't equality there then. In Virginia and all of the shires in Virginia, people were taxed that worked. And if you will notice our tithable lists don't include white women. They include numbers of slaves, but not slaves' names sometimes. And they include people who worked. And Anthony Johnson's wife and daughters were listed in the tithable list as workers. And so they had to pay tax. I don't know what the tax rate was or how much they paid. I think that when you have lived through adverse conditions, and I don't just mean the fire, but when you have lived through times of adversity, I think it pulls people together. Anthony Johnson and Mary, his two sons, Richard and John, his daughters, whose names we don't know, came together because they were a family. They could depend on one another to decide what to do. And that's the only way the system worked. That was the only way he could farm that farm, was that he could depend on those people. And that's what he did at the time of the fire. I think the colony life for black and mulatto women was difficult. I think that they were the bottom rung of all the people that lived. But I think that within the group of black and mulatto women, that there were some lives that were just unbelievably cruel and severe. And while other lives weren't wonderful lives, they were better. I think that Mary Johnson probably lived the best life of a black woman during that time. She had a husband, she had children, she had that property, and she was exempt from some hardships. Didn't mean she didn't work hard. She worked hard. But then there were other women who, as they had children, their children were taken, and if not sold, given away. Some children were given as gifts. Other women who were even born free but didn't have the protection of a husband were at the mercy of whoever. They were at the mercy of slave owners. They were at the mercy of the mistress of the house. They were just living horrible lives. I think that the person that I think of when I hear black women in the 17th century, the person that I think of and that I admire was Jane Webb. And I just felt so close to her. I felt like I could feel what she was feeling as she wanted to get married and couldn't, was denied marriage. And then to have the slave owner of the man she wanted to marry say, well, you can't marry him, but you can be with him if you give yourself to me for 7 years. To live that 7 years and think that at the end of it, she's going to be free and he's going to be free, and then to get there and to discover that none of it was true. And to have to go on, she couldn't just walk away because now she had 3 children plus this man that she wanted to be with. And Jane Webb was probably one of the first women to use the court system, one of the first black women to use the court system. I mean, over and over, she went to court and fought for her children, trying to free them from Thomas Savage. And then Thomas Savage dies, and they're not free. He has left them to his children. They're a part of his estate. So a black woman's life during the 17th century was just incredibly hard. Not just the work, and the work had to have been hard, but it was emotionally hard. During the beginning years of the shore, the settling of the shore, the reason that the court system was open to black people was that there was no specific law that denied them access to the courts. And so they were able to use the court system. They were able to file suits. They were able to be a part of the court system. As the time went on, probably 1660 or so, it started to be shut down. And so when we got to by the time we reached the end of slavery, black people's only use of the court system was the ability to testify against another black or to testify for another black. But that was their only use of the court. Earlier, there was nothing to stop them from using it. All they needed to do was to have the knowledge that it was there, and they used it. The Northampton County Court records in the order books, in an order book in the Northampton County Court record, Anthony the Negro was distressed because he did not have his own property. He did not know what to do. Some people feel that Anthony the Negro was Anthony Johnson. I'm not sure about that. It appears to me that what this person wanted was a plot, was a piece of ground, not 250 acres. And he wanted to know, now I know mine own ground. After this decision was made, in court, then he knew that it was his and he could work if he wanted to, which is what he said. And he knew when he could play when he wanted to. But I'm not sure that that refers to Anthony Johnson. It's possible, but we could be referring to a garden. That statement, "now I know mine own ground," represents more than just that specific thing. It represents a mindset. This is mine. I know what I can do with it. I don't have to do anything with it. Or I can do with it what I want to every day, once a week. And I know that if I'm not working on the ground, I can sit in my house, I can play. It was freedom. It talked about freedom. As time went on, more African people were brought into the colony. And when you look at slavery and the condition of black people at that time, you might think, slavery was a cruel institution, and the people who thought of it were cruel. It wasn't something that came about all at once. It came about law by law. It came about when there was the need to control those people that were present. And as more Africans came into the colonies, more controls were necessary. And so we can even tell from the first law that was passed, the law that denied Indians and blacks ammunition, that the slave owners and the plantation owners were thinking about safety. They were thinking about cutting off the ability for the Indian and the black to defend themselves or to wreak havoc in the colony. So as more blacks came into the colony, there was the need to control them. And slavery grew out of that need, not just for a workforce, but also for control. Laws that related to slaves, mulattoes, and Indians were laws that came about when the need arose for them to be controlled. Oh, they said that so badly. I think that we think about slavery as this complete package that just came to evil landowners. It touched poor black people, and there it is. And it didn't happen that way. It happened one law at a time, one person at a time. The first law that was passed was a law that denied ammunition, firepower to Indians and blacks. And as they were needed, as laws were needed, as slave owners and as landowners felt the need to control a different behavior, year after year, they added more laws until finally, 1691, they passed the law that made it illegal to free a black slave unless they were leaving the colony. So by then, it was pretty much set that this was going to be a slave society. But the laws that were passed, there were laws that made slaves real estate, which made it easy to buy and sell them, to leave them in wills. There were laws that said that if a child was born of a slave mother, the child was automatically a slave. There were laws that said if a child was born of a white mother and a slave father, that the child then may follow the condition of the mother and be free, but it would be indentured for a certain amount of years. So the laws just happened as they were needed. We just moved towards slavery, one law at a time. Slave codes didn't come about all at one time. They came about one at a time. If there was a runaway slave, then we passed a law to make it illegal to run away. When there was fear of an insurrection, we passed a law that made owning a gun illegal or denying the ability to own a gun. When we wanted to start being serious about slavery, two laws made it really serious. Two early laws made it serious. One was the law that made the child subject to the condition of the mother. That way, if you had one woman slave, if she bore a child every year, that child was a slave. The other law that was very serious was the law that made slaves property, that made them real estate. That way you could transfer ownership with a deed. By will, you could leave them in your will. You could transfer them with a bill of sale. They were legal property, not unlike the car of today. They were legally yours. The other law, the last law that was not the last law that was passed, but the last law in the 1600s that was just so important was the law that made it illegal to free a slave if the slave did not leave the colony. And that meant that there was no incentive, no matter how wonderful the slave may have been to you. And you were saying you were having this pang of conscience, and you were saying, I cannot own this person. You had to give the person up completely. You couldn't have a friend. I mean, they had to leave the colony. And so there was no incentive until 1782, the first incentive to free a slave. By the time the end of the century came, Anthony Johnson's children and grandchildren may well have been fighting to stay free, because many slaves, many free people were sold into slavery. They couldn't prove that they were free. They had no way of letting anybody know that they were free. So if a plantation owner came by and said, this is my slave and I want to sell him, you were sold. So many people who had been free, whose parents had been free, were sold into slavery. So it was just a time of peril. For free black people, it was a time of peril. If you were a slave, your life was pretty well set. You knew that you were going to get up every morning without any way of deciding what you were going to do with your own life, that your whole life was subject to the will of somebody else. So a slave's life was cut and dried, but a free black's life was a life of peril. There's a spider on you. I'm sorry. The last piece of land owned that we know of, owned by the Johnson family, a Johnson son, was called Angola. And I'd like to believe that Angola represented a memory, if maybe not his memory, the memory of his father. Angola in Africa. And I think that, sometimes we say that black people, that Africans had no memory of what happened to them before they came to this country. I think that there were memories, and I think that memories were passed down. I think that there was a concentrated effort for them to have no culture or memory. But there were memories, and they came out in little ways like that. In sometimes in naming their children African day names, they came out. And I think that Angola was just one example of a memory coming out. I wonder about the freedom that the Johnsons were able to maintain after they moved from Northampton, Accomack County. And I have thought sometimes that maybe the reason that they moved was that they could see what was coming, that they could see slavery happening, and that they were moving north thinking that this was an easier place. The North is an easier place, Maryland, Delaware. We don't really know. But maybe that was the thought, that this is a place with more freedom. Maybe Virginia's laws are coming too fast, or they were affecting them in ways that we don't even know. And that was the reason that they moved. We're never going to know, but we do know that a free African living at the end of the 17th century lived a hard life. I enjoy reading the records. I enjoy knowing how other people lived. And maybe it's the dreamer that makes you want to know. You know, a person who wants to live outside of themselves wants to know how somebody else lived. And when you read court records, you know, the sky is the limit for imagining how somebody else lived. Records that relate to Black people are just so interesting. The records of African people in the record books in Accomack and Northampton counties give us insight, you know, sometimes not in the specifics of their day-to-day lives, but the records give us insight into what the person was about. We see strengths and weaknesses. You know, we see young people who have been taken from their mother, and we have to feel their pain. I mean, what would it be like if we lost our child? We see African people that have been brought to court for stealing food, and we have to know what that was like, to be hungry. You know, they weren't stealing large things, they were stealing something to eat. So we see the strengths of people, we see the weaknesses of people. You know, we see the whole human condition in our records. We just need to read. January 1639, Act 10 was passed. All persons except Negroes to be provided with arms and ammunition, or be fined at pleasure of the governor and council. This was the first law affecting Africans, and it was the law that denied them the rights of other people to own guns and ammunition. December 1662, Act 12 was passed. Negro women's children to serve according to the condition of the mother. Whereas some doubts have arisen whether children got by any Englishman upon a Negro woman should be slave or free, be it therefore enacted and declared by this present Grand Assembly that all children born in this country shall be held bond or free, only according to the condition of the mother. This law tells us that if whatever the condition a mother is, the child will follow. If the mother is free, then the child will be free. If the mother was a slave, the child would be a slave. The only difference is that if the mother was free white, was a white woman, and the father was a Negro slave, then the child may be born free, but the child will have to serve an indenture of up to 30 years. April 1691, April 1691, Act 16. The act for suppressing outlying slaves. In case any Negroes, mulattoes, or other slave or slaves lying out as aforesaid shall resist, run away, or refuse to deliver and surrender himself or themselves to any person or person that shall be by lawful authority employed to apprehend, it shall be lawful for such person or person to kill and destroy such Negroes, mulattoes, and other slave or slaves by gun or any otherwise whatsoever, that where any Negro or mulatto, slave or slaves shall be killed in pursuance to this act, the owner or owners of such Negro or mulatto slave shall be paid for such Negro or mulatto slave 4,000 pounds of tobacco by the public. This law was passed in Virginia to make sure that, first of all, slaves understood what the penalty was to run away, to prevent them from running away. But it also ensured the slave owner that if the slave ran away, that they would be compensated, that they would not lose. So this was a law that sent a message to the slave and also to the slave owner. Another part of Act 16 passed April 1691. No Negro or mulatto be after the end of the present session of Assembly set free by any person or person whatsoever, unless such person or persons, their heirs, executors, or administrators, pay for the transportation of such Negroes or Negroes out of the country within 6 months after such setting them free. This law is the law that says that slavery is fine. It says that not only is slavery fine and accepted by the colony, but we're going to protect slavery, and we're going to protect our investment by keeping it. This law was the final blow. There are several very good reasons to study slavery and to study the history of African Americans. One of the first reasons is that we have African American History Month every year, and we really need that. But we also need to feel that it isn't African American history only. You know, African Americans and white people have never lived a life that was not dependent upon the other. I mean, it was not an even dependency, but there was nothing done in Northampton County or in Accomack County that one race did. You know, not the grand houses that were built, you know, not the dams that were dug, not the farms that were farmed. We did it all together. And there needs to be a sense of American history, you know, and an awakening to the idea that we all worked here. You know, we did different jobs, but we all worked here, you know, and we all built this. And studying slavery will serve to show what kinds of things each of us did, you know, not individually, but what kinds of things groups did. And you know, it is a most important thing. Another part of studying slavery is the feeling among Black people that somehow, because we lived through this really awful time, that we were responsible. Somehow we did something that made this happen to us. You know, and we need to get rid of that. We need not be ashamed of having survived the worst 300 years in American history.